There are lots of words that you and I use to describe our family. Organized, chaotic, close-knit, dysfunctional, messy. The lists go on and on. You and I have many ways to describe the families in which we were born and that are part of course, who we are. But in all of my years of priesthood and all of my years of living and all of my years of visiting with families and with parents, I very seldom, I've never heard parents or family people describe their family as holy. It's usually not a word that you and I use. And why is that? Well, oftentimes I think it's because, of course, we don't understand what holiness really means. Because for whatever reason, you and I have been maybe taught, or we've just figured it out on our own, that somehow holiness needs to be equated with perfection, or it needs to somehow mean this piety or this sanctity that so oftentimes we think can never, ever be ours. And so we're convinced that holiness is not something that is attainable, at least for us in this lifetime. But my friends, it's wrong. We're wrong. Holiness is not perfection. Holiness is not piety. Holiness is not sanctity. Holiness is, of course, recognizing what we heard in today's second reading from the letter to John. We are God's children now. We are God's children now. Not next week, not after we die. We are God's children now. And the way in which John goes on to say in today's second reading, the way in which we know that God remains in us is that He has given to us His Spirit. My friends, you and I all received the same call from God. It's a universal call. It's the same call given to everyone who is immersed in the waters of baptism. And that universal call is the call to holiness. Holiness. It means wholeness. Holiness means that we always remember that we are God's children now, which means we have to recognize that deep down within us, there is this incredible thing called grace. Grace is at the very center of our life and our existence and our families. Grace has been planted there, and it exists, and it dwells, and it desires to be brought forth and to be made manifest through the gift of our families. And so the church wants to make sure that we understand this call to holiness, and that we understand and that we remember that our families are indeed holy, and that we remember and that we understand that we are God's children now, and that we remember and that we understand that grace is at the very center of our beings. And so the way in which the church wants us to remember and understand that is it gives us this feast during this Christmas season, the Feast of the Holy Family. And of course, it provides for us the example of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Were they perfect? By no means. Yes, Jesus was without sin, but they were not perfect. Today's gospel is proof of it. It's the reason why I love the year C in the Gospel of Luke, because it gives us a real human story of a real human family. And there are two things about the story we just heard that make it incredibly human. One is, of course, that the child is lost. And I can't imagine that there's any greater fear that a parent would have and that would be losing their child. Why we are constantly, as parents, reminding children to grab a hold of our hand, especially when we're in the midst of large groups of people. So imagine now, Mary and Joseph, why Luke tells us that they're experiencing great anxiety. Duh. He's lost. And they've been looking for him not one, not two, but 3 days. For 3 days they've been searching for him in the midst of Jerusalem, where, because of course everybody has gone there for the Passover, there are thousands and thousands of people. And so in the midst of the crowds, they're looking. And finally, they find him in the temple. Imagine what Mary and Joseph are feeling and experiencing and thinking at that very moment. Why, the only thing Mary can do is say, "Why have you done this to us?" And then, Jesus being 12, soon to be a teenager, you know what I'm talking about, right? Gets a little mouthy with Mary. "Well, why are you looking for me? Do you not know that this is where I need to be? In my Father's house." You see, there's that tension that every family experiences as children get to that, that teenage era of their life in which they want to fly on their own, and the parents are kind of saying, "You're not quite ready yet to leave the nest." So today's gospel gives us this element of fear that all parents experience who have lost a child or who have worried about losing one. And it gives us that tension that parents and certainly children experience as they're growing up. But the good news is this, and perhaps the line that we miss most often in today's gospel story is at the very end, when it tells us that aging is a good thing. Jesus grew up in wisdom and in strength before God and the human family. He grew up. That's the beautiful thing about how we respond and how we grow in that universal call to holiness, is we allow time and aging to make the difference. Isn't it true that you and I, as a teenage child, were not able to do what we can do as an adult child, that you and I were unable to do as an infant what we can now do as an adult, and et cetera, et cetera? Isn't it true that mothers who once time thought that this was intolerable and unacceptable can all of a sudden now, after the 10th child, i.e. in the case of me, all of a sudden say, it's okay? What happened? What happened? Did they get weak? Maybe, perhaps, I don't think so. But I think all of a sudden we begin to realize, because of time and aging, we begin to realize what's really important and what isn't important. And the way in which you and I then respond to this universal call to holiness is we find that at the center of our lives is this incredible thing called grace, which is God himself, and we then try to manifest that grace by the way in which we live our lives in our human families and in the communities in which we live in. And so we try to do the commandments, which are summarized, as we heard again in today's second reading, in the simple act of love. That when you and I try the best that we can, given the circumstances that we find ourselves in, realizing that it's not going to be perfect, and it's not always going to be complete, and it's not always going to be nice, and it's not always going to be clean, and it's not always going to be, well, I can go on and on. But that ultimately we do what we can do to bring love forth into our relationships, into those close relationships that are ours in the human family, and those other relationships that are ours as we strive to live in the community in which we find ourselves. And when we bring that act of love forward, why then holiness is made manifest. And we claim our rightful title, and we show it to others. We let everyone know through our acts of kindness and love that we are God's children now.